It's all you, Fred.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. I'm sure we'll have some other folks joining us momentarily. We have about 100 sign up, and usually we get about half of the ones that sign up. So before we introduce John, just two very quick announcements. We'll be starting again in September with our Science of Autism series. I think our first one's going to be about transition and transition planning, and our speaker is from the University of Nebraska. And we have the other speakers, we're just sorting out the dates. So we're all set for the fall, and we'll have an interesting set of topics. We're doing transition, evidence-based treatments in autism, gender issues in autism, which is a very hot topic. And I've forgotten what the other one was, but it'll come to me. The second thing I wanted to mention by way of announcements is in the fall and into the winter, we're going to do on the weekend an asynchronous, meaning it's live only. It's not something you can go back to, it's live. Course on adults with autism. It will start in the fall and continue into the winter, 12 sessions total. We're going to put a notice, a flyer on our website. But if you're interested in getting information on that adult course, please let us know. We're happy to send you a PDF of the course information. It should be very interesting. With all that being said, let me introduce my colleague, John Molteni, who is both a licensed psychologist and an ABA therapist. And he's going to be giving a very interesting talk this morning, and I think you'll find it really very useful in your practices. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to bug out of your way.
Okay, thank you, Fred.
Sure that are you working as a co-host?
I am, yes. I'm going to share my slides. All right, so far technology is on our side, which is good.
Right.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I see some familiar names here, which actually increases my anxiety. So I'm just going to put that out there. But thank you for coming nonetheless. I was asked to do this talk last year, here and it was really came around a discussion around this idea of supporting psychological flexibility or acceptance and commitment therapy. So the title of this was a lot longer when I started, and to make it more marketable, we had to sort of look at ways to make it more appealing, I guess, to the content and the people who might be willing to participate. So we're going to be on a journey today, a little bit of a journey, about an hour. So we're going to kind of go through things. This is going to be a very broad overview of some ideas related to concepts of what we'd call relating, and how that applies to acceptance and commitment training or therapy. And then we'll talk about some what we know. This is in terms of the science of autism, this is very much an emerging scientific field in terms of working with people with autism or autistic individuals. And so note that, we'll be talking about some findings that have been presented and some directions we need to go in. But I think it's a very exciting area to be in and to think about, and has a lot of potential broad applications for the individuals that we serve. So please, again, feel free to provide some questions or ask questions in the chat, and we'll get to those towards the end. But before we begin, this may have been you at some point. This was certainly me yesterday, last night. I probably spent upwards of 10 to 15 hours to prepare for a 1-hour talk. And why is that, you might ask? Well, because oftentimes, and you may have experienced this, but this is my personal story. You may have experienced these ideas like, is this going to be a useful talk? I don't say good talk. Good is somewhat subjective. Is it going to be useful? Are people going to come to attend? Am I going to present well? Am I really an expert in this area? Right? Imposter syndrome, those types of things. It still happens. Been doing this for 30 years or so, and yet still there are these things that pop into one's head, and it might keep you up at night, and it might interfere with how you're doing things. I had a actually good experience yesterday, which I will share as well. We received course evaluations yesterday, or back from our students at the end of the semester. This is something that I asked for. I'd say, please, students, fill these out. Now, these go out by email, and the return rates are usually very poor. And they were, for this one again, very poor. And usually it's people who either really like you or really don't like you that you get responses from. And so I see this email come up. It says, course evals are in. And I say, okay, this is where I'm going to hear from my students and hopefully get some useful feedback that I can apply to my future courses. And opened up a few, and there were none. Literally none of the students had done them. And then one student did them. And in one of my larger classes, I had about 5. And there was this very nice comment about me as an educator, which was kind of very useful. I felt it was something that was positive, and I felt better about myself. And so one of the things that we're going to be talking about is how we apply value to certain things. What are our values? And then how do we use that to develop some committed action pieces? And that's sort of broadly speaking about our concepts of relational frames and acceptance and commitment therapy. So what we're going to do is start to talk about this, and where I talk about these experiences or this language that we engage in that's important to how we function on a daily basis and how we relate those things to our experiences. So we're going to start with this concept of relational frame theory and language, because it's really the foundation for where we start to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy or training. And so those of us, develop language, and that's something I will preface a lot of this with when we're talking about this concept of relating and relating stimuli. It generally involves individuals with more developed language skills, and that includes within the autistic population as well. So just so you know, the things we're going to be discussing will likely be more applicable to those individuals you work with who have more developed language skills. Not to say that it doesn't happen with those with less developed language skills or those who are not verbally communicating, but just that's where the literature kind of stands at this point. So relating stimuli is a language-based process, and it's the way that we look at the 2 stimuli or more. Okay. We can relate things in a number of different ways, one of those things being equivalence. So the printed word dog to the spoken word dog to a picture of a dog to an actual dog. These are all equivalent. They are arbitrary stimuli. They are things that are not related in any way, but they become related through our sort of shared language, our common language, social norms, etc. So that's an equivalence relation. That's how things are related. You can also relate things based on opposites, tall, short, hot, or cold. Comparisons, we do this all the time. Are we doing better or worse, bigger, smaller, etc. Spatial relations between things, in front of, behind, next to, above, under, right? These are all related. Hierarchical, president, vice president, speaker of the house, kind of the succession. And then these didactic frames, which is what we consider the perspective of the speaker. So as a speaker, I speak in the I here now. If I said to you now, point to your left, I'm going to point in this direction. You're probably going to point in the other direction because your perspective is different. Now, this is important because as we discuss relating, that obviously will have an important piece when we talk about perspective taking. So thinking about another person's perspective, right? I can say what is coming from my perspective, and then someone else's perspective is going to be different, but being able to take that perspective is what's important. And these are all ways that stimuli can be related. So why is that important is because we have this concept that we talk about, the transformation of function. So how we relate to stimuli is going to change the value of that word or item. Okay, and I have an example here. If gold is more expensive than silver, silver is cheaper than gold. Again, those are comparisons. All right. And then if we say bronze is cheaper than silver, silver is cheaper than gold, then bronze is cheaper than gold. And overall, you're going to prefer gold if you're going to invest in precious metals, right? So the idea is that we've transformed the function of bronze from being perhaps a neutral stimulus, a neutral metal that has no particular value, and then we relate it to other precious metals, and then it has some value. It transforms the function of that particular thing. And what can this mean for us? Well, we learn a lot through language. People tell us things. I'm telling you things now. This might change some aspect or the function of some things that you do, how you might practice, or how you might consider other people's language. Okay. So as we relate things, it alters the function. So one example is the concept of punishment. So as a behavior analyst, punishment has a very specific and functional definition. It is the presentation or removal of a stimulus that occurs contingent on the behavior that leads to a reduction in the future probability of behavior, right? It's a functional definition. So it doesn't talk about structure, it talks about function. So in certain cases, calling a student to answer a question in class can be aversive, meaning that they might reduce their participation or eye contact or other types of behaviors in class for fear of getting called on. Okay, praise in some cases, again, I'm relating this to students in my classes, praising them in front of the class could be also aversive, right? So we saying, well, I delivered praise. Well, you actually delivered a punishing stimulus. Okay. Experience, that's direct experience, but it can also be done through language. Oftentimes in my classes, I will talk with students about questions. I will ask them questions and no one will respond. And I will sit there for several minutes and think, well, why are people not responding? And it tends to go back to a learning history. It's a history of being right or wrong, right? This sort of idea of, or punishment in the past for being wrong or getting the wrong answer or not looking as smart, quote unquote, in class. And so you have a lot of avoidance behavior. And what I'll often do with my class is talk to them about, where would you rather make a mistake? Would you rather make a mistake in class here with me in an environment where we can talk about it and address it? Or do you want to make the mistake out there in your professional career? So I train behavior analysts and I work with pre-service special education teachers as well in terms of my role at Southern. And once you change that frame, right, you relate it to a learning experience as opposed to a positive or aversive experience, oftentimes that will change. Students also will engage in language. Well, they'll preface a lot of their answers with, I don't know if this is right, but, and again, I would talk to them about, well, how about perhaps you are right? I don't know if this is right. Right? That's a simple change in language, but it's also, again, helping to reframe or help them to relate differently to the verbal behavior that they engage in, right? Not to think about it as a right or wrong, pass, fail, ABC grade type of thing, but more of a learning opportunity to take advantage of working with someone who has some experience in the field and might be able to provide something. Okay. As with anything, this is related to the environment or the context, right? So all of what we're talking about is contextual. Behavior occurs in a context, including language. Language is behavior, called it verbal behavior. We'll call it language for the purpose of this particular presentation, but verbal behavior is how we generally talk about it. And the idea of rule governance is this idea that people will learn things simply by being told things, right? You might state a contingency. or state something in a presentation or a talk, or talk confidently about something on the internet, which everybody does, and people believe it, or people act as if it were the case. Okay, some people, you can tell, don't touch the hot stove, and they won't touch the hot stove because, don't touch the hot stove because you will get hurt. That's the contingency. And some people will say, well, I don't want to touch the hot stove. I've never touched the hot stove intentionally. Inadvertently, of course, yes, I have, but not intentionally. Some people want to touch the hot stove. Some people are going to touch the hot stove. That's what we call contingency-shaped behavior. But rule governance is very powerful in terms of how we do things. We learn a lot, again, by people telling us things. Okay. But overall, what we're looking at, again, behavior and context and the function, right? We're not talking about the content of language in treatment or therapy, in terms of acceptance and commitment therapy. We're not talking about what your language looks like. We're talking about the function of it. What function does it serve? Okay. So I'm going to start with some basic discussion about how we relate stimulus, how we relate stimuli, and how we derive stimulus relations. Okay. Just so you know, to reference, A and B are just stimuli, and then R is the relation between them. And it's the idea of that if one stimulus is A is related to B and B is related to A, and then if A is related to C, then C is related to A. So this is what we call symmetry, or in some cases, mutual entailment, right? So if I teach you that the word cat is related to the 30 letters CAT, then that reverse is true. So if I present you with the CAT, you might say the word cat, or you might engage in some other behaviors. Or so you a picture of a cat with the printed word cat. You might then, when shown the written word cat, point to the picture of the cat. Okay. I'm going to have an example of this in a bit, so don't worry about this sort of as a general concept, but more of sort of what we're thinking about. And again, we're going to be looking at how this is very sort of a powerful way of the point is this occurs without additional instruction. And this final combinatorial entailment transitivity is relating between A is related to B, B is related to C, then A is related to C. Okay, so spoken word cat is related to picture word cat, and picture word cat is related to picture of a cat, then the spoken word and the picture will be related in some way. Okay, here's an example of it. All right, we have objects, and in this particular diagram, the dotted lines or the dashed lines are these are the untaught relations, whereas the solid lines are the taught relations. So if I teach an object to a picture, all right, so I have a toy car, and I have a picture of a car, and I teach that relationship. So when I show you a car, you point to this picture, or if I show you a cake, an actual piece of cake, you point to the picture of a cake. And then I teach you that there's a picture of a cake to a printed name, or the printed word of cake, or picture of a car, printed word of car. I teach those two relations. And then these other four relations emerge, or they're derived, okay, without any additional training. So we use this, or with the concept of these derived relations, is a very powerful teaching mechanism. It's an ability for us to really teach things in a very efficient way, again, for individuals with more developed language abilities. Okay. We have this another pictured names dictated to the individual. So pictures, printed names, and then we add, right, this is what we would call sort of naming, right? We can name a spoken name spoken by the individual. Okay, so again, we teach a few relations, and then we have this emergence of these other relations without additional training. Okay. So derived responding occurs when untrained responses follow the teaching of related responses or related stimuli. Okay, so again, what we're looking for is how do we associate stimuli And then how are these things related to one another and what emerges from that? Okay, and this includes stimuli that are associated with reinforcement and punishment. And this is going to be important when we start to talk about things related to therapy or psychotherapy or acceptance and commitment therapy, because it's this rule governance and this relationship between things that are punitive or not, right? There's an example of the cat. I've used that a couple of times, right? That's just teaching relations between spoken word, printed word, an object, or an actual cat. Okay, and when you add something to that, and we'll provide an example in a minute, it adds a component to it. So if you've had an interaction with a cat, maybe you're a cat person, you love cats, you've had wonderful experiences with cats, right? That might elicit a physiological response that we might say is joy. Okay, it might evoke some behavior related to you discussing your experiences with cats and how much you love cats and rescue cats and do things like that. Some may not have very much interactions with cats, and then you might get scratched by a cat, and then therefore this will be associated with catness. And then you then have more negative experiences or avoidance of cats. That can occur without experiencing a scratch, by the way. That can be told to you, right? That you should avoid cats because cats scratch. Or you might be allergic to cats and you'll start sneezing, or whatever it might be. Again, that can be through rule-governed processes as well. It doesn't have to be an experience. You don't have to experience these things. And this is, again, why language is very powerful and why it can be so debilitating in many cases, in the way that it is leads to more restriction in terms of the behaviors that we engage in. Okay. So relating, as we're relating, we sort of treat stimuli as if the stimulus were present. And I'm going to use the example of spiders. I don't know if anybody has, I'm going to show a picture of a spider in case anybody is has issues with that. I just want to give you a heads up that there's going to be a spider picture coming up. Okay. And again, we can learn through direct teaching experience and through language or rule governance. All right, so here's an example. This is a picture of a tarantula. This is one I found off the internet picture. And there may be some relations here that can be taught, such as a spider is an arachnid, a tarantula is poisonous, it's hairy. There are many that live in Australia. And you might, it might evoke a response of eek. It may be scary. I don't have to teach that, but that might be something that occurs. You notice down here we have danger. That's not necessarily something that's taught, but I'm going to go into that into the next example. So we have sort of these relations, okay, between this stimulus, a spider, notice a picture of a spider, and some of these other things. Okay, they're now related through the use of our language. Then I can teach, perhaps, or tell someone that poisonous things are dangerous. Okay, and then we start to develop these reciprocal, okay, or mutual entailed or symmetrical in some cases, relations between things. So when I think of an arachnid, I think of a spider. There are other arachnids. This isn't a biology class, but we'll just throw it in there. When I think of eek or things that are scary, I might think of a spider. If I think of hairy things, I might think of a spider. I think of Australia, I might think of spiders. Poisonous, spider. You see the relationship, right? So I've taught a few relations and I've started to generate these other ones. They don't need additional teaching. They start to develop. And then lastly, we get all these other untaught relations. Nice. You can kind of see how this can grow. These aren't all of them. These are just the ones that I could get on a page without making it too busy. Okay. Then you start to see relationships between Australia and arachnids, and Australia in danger. Okay. Australia means tarantulas, right? So now I've canceled my trip to Australia because Australia is dangerous because it has hairy poisonous spiders. Right? Or Australia is dangerous. Now, if anybody's from Australia, I don't think that. I know, again, I'm not saying this is true or not. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It's how these stimuli are related to one another. Okay, so you might see where this becomes a phobia of spiders. Okay, I might be in a position now where, oh my gosh, I do not want to be in places where there are spiders, particularly hairy spiders like that. Okay. And then we can add something to this relationship as well. I have added another hairy creature from Australia, the kangaroo. Now, where might those things develop relations? And you can see where this could expand. Now, kangaroo might be associated with Australia, which is dangerous, etc. Maybe not arachnid. Obviously, there are things that doesn't have to match all of them. It might be safe and might be the opposite of a tarantula. Okay, I looked for a picture of a hairy man from Australia, and I got pictures of Chris Hemsworth only. So I figured there was not a lot of phobia around that. But I hope you can see that this is a very powerful mechanism. This is all language based, right? All from descriptions or from people talking or from other things. Or again, we just generate this from the stimuli around us, from language, from what we read, what we hear. Okay, so again, because that's so powerful, it happens very quickly. So in terms of teaching derived relational responding, there are a couple of examples I provided here, and there's been a review of the literature. And again, the idea is we teach a few relationships between stimuli, and then we generate or derive a number of other relationships without additional training. So some have looked at answering WH questions. Okay, and this is not just, right, this is broad. This is what we call a generalized operant of relating. I learned how to ask WH questions broadly, not just to specific questions. This one was done with community helpers, but it was done to teach more broad application of answering WH questions, not just who does this, right, teaching one specific exemplar. Requesting for more or less based on a number of target. How we categorize things, all right, so teaching categorization. And generally the research suggests that a level of what we call a naming repertoire is needed to derive. And we've talked about this in terms of what we call speaker and listener behavior. Okay, I need to be able to identify that thing and name it, and also respond to it when its name is given to me. Okay, so naming, broadly speaking, seems to be an underlying skill that leads to or supports individuals in being able to derive relations. Okay. So in the review of literature, this is a very recent one. There were 53 studies included in this. There were some broad applications, but they did point out that there are some areas that need to be broadly developed. A lot of the research was involving individuals with autism and intellectual disabilities, but not all of the participants had intellectual disabilities. So some need to disentangle some of these data sets and being able to more clearly identify what are the prerequisite skills, what are the measurements we're using to determine whether someone has the ability to derive relations, etc. So again, sort of there's a good amount of initial literature around this, but they certainly suggest there's some areas for improvement. So now that we can derive relations, right, and if we're deriving relations, let's talk about this in terms of comorbidities. So overall, there's a general agreement in the literature about a high level of comorbidity of psychiatric diagnoses in autistic individuals. This is the Simonoff study is an older study, but it's a larger sample, 70% with one diagnosis, 40%, 41% with two or more. Social anxiety, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder were the most common. This more recent Rim et al. Article was a population-based study in South Korea, which looked at risk factors for comorbid diagnosis, and basically, again, found a high risk for comorbidities. And this was through existing population data. They have universal healthcare, and so they were able to look at records for the entirety of the country. And the later the diagnosis, the higher the risk for comorbid diagnosis. And I don't think that's necessarily surprising to anybody. I hope it's not surprising to anybody. If we're not able to identify things early, then we're not able to work on some of those skills or those abilities in order to navigate more complex social environments. Ultimately, we're looking at functional impairment. When we think about diagnostic criteria, we're thinking about functional impairment. So how does social anxiety interfere with engagement and subsequent social development? So if I'm anxious socially and I'm not engaging socially, that might exacerbate issues with social development over time. Again, that's not specific to autistic individuals. It's just a statement when we think about what is that functional impairment that we're thinking about. So given that we have a high level of comorbidity, I'm not going to change direction. I'm going to build on that to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy. So this is a definition of acceptance and commitment therapy by Stephen Hayes, who is essentially the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy. You can find a lot of TED Talks by him on YouTube. The Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, which is where this quote was found. It's actually from a book that he wrote. So ACT, and it's ACT, it's not ACT, just in case you're wondering, it's ACT. And that's appropriate because we're talking about a behavioral therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. ACT is a functional contextual therapy approach based on relational frame theory, which views human psychological problems dominantly as problems of psychological inflexibility, fostered by cognitive fusion and experiential avoidance in the context of a therapeutic relation. ACT brings direct contingencies and indirect verbal processes to bear on the experiential establishment of greater psychological flexibility, primarily through, and this is important, acceptance, diffusion, establishment of a transcendent sense of self, contact with the present moment, values, and building larger and larger patterns of committed action linked to those values. So that is the big, broad definition. What does that mean? So functional contextualism, this is what we talk about, okay? We understand behavior occurs in a context. It's not just the behavior piece, right? That's important. Also the broader context in which an individual lives, right? Their learning history, cultural values, the things that they experience on a day-to-day basis. So again, this isn't something where we engage in certain cases in cognitive behavior therapy. We address sort of irrational thinking or negative self-statements. We're trying to understand the function of those or the context in which those occur. And if we understand the context, we can help to predict and control it, and not us as the therapist controlling it, but thinking about our clients' ability to, again, and we'll talk about what that means in a broader sense, in pursuit of meaningful goals. So description, prediction, and control is sort of the scientific framework from which we function, right? If we can describe something, if we can predict when it's going to happen, then we can sort of control its onset or offset. And that's part of the sort of scientific method. It's how we think about things. Deterministic for sure. But understanding behavior and context is what is relevant here. A psychological suffering occurs. We're not very good at problem solving. In fact, it's one of the areas we focus on a lot. In terms of ACT, is how do we think about problem solving, right? How can we describe an event, right? And again, think about this in terms of the scientific method. How do we describe something? How do we explain it? And how do we deal with it? How do we problem solve around it, right? We often, because we're not that great, once we sort of in something, we're not great at problem solving our way out, right? We often function under very ineffective or in some cases very restrictive rules based on our learning history, things that are good or bad, right? Or I need to do this because, right? If I'm going to be a good professor, I need my students to like me, right? That would be an ineffective rule. because if you're doing things just to have your students like you, you're likely, you might not be meeting the goals that you're trying to do in terms of instructing or teaching. Okay, doesn't mean you have to be mean, but there may be other things that we're thinking about. Okay. Control of behavior through literal language. Cognitive fusion is the idea that sort of you and your thoughts are one. And if you do something, you are bad. If you do this, you're bad. If you answer a question incorrectly in class, you're dumb. Okay. This idea that if I make a mistake, I am less than. Okay. Those are things that are what we call cognitive fusion. Excuse me, experiential avoidance. It's kind of our response to most things that are challenging, right? If things are troubling you, thoughts are troubling you, you try to avoid those things, right? If you're having trouble sleeping, and I only speak from experience, you might engage in behaviors that try to avoid that, right? I might stay up, I might watch television, I'm going to scroll the internet, I'm going to do things other than sleep, right? Because I'm trying to avoid these thoughts that are occurring, right? If I say, don't think about a blue elephant, you're probably going to think about a blue elephant, right? Don't think about that, right? Or escaping or avoiding, okay? I would do things like shut off my emails, from work and say, well, this is for work-life balance. I'm not going to look at my emails for the evening or for the weekend. Or I'm going to engage in things that I maybe like to do, like play video game or do things like that. But in many cases, in reality, that was more avoidance of other things in order to control some feelings that I may be having at the time. Okay. And then lastly, psychological flexibility. All right. So how do we contact private events? And private events are what we call verbal behavior, covert verbal behavior, right? Thoughts, feelings. They're private events. They're our, and their behavior, by the way, but they are ours. They occur under the skin. So therefore, they're hard to access from anybody else, right? That's the perspective taking piece. But, right, how do we experience them without trying to change them and move? This may seem counterintuitive in terms of dealing with challenges, called psychopathology, if you want to call it that. But experiencing private events, feelings of inferiority or anxiety or wanting to feel more than or less than. Okay, experiencing those without trying to change them, while still moving forward towards valued goals, okay? Valued behaviors, committed action. Okay? That's the challenging part, and that's a bit of a shift, right? Because again, a lot of, at least in historically, cognitive behavior therapy was a lot of attempts to address irrational thinking, right? To challenge it, challenge irrational thoughts, challenge negative self-statements, right? This is not about challenging. This is about these things are going to occur. These things are going to happen. We can, right? We are going to experience these things. How do we experience them and observe them? Okay. So in terms of acceptance, we're talking about experience them as they occur and as they are, without altering them, without trying to alter their frequency, without trying to alter their structure. Okay, observing them objectively. Okay, I'm having the feeling that. Okay, we'll talk about that in terms of self as context as well. Okay, cognitive diffusion is this idea that we're trying to remove, right? You are not your thoughts. Okay. Your thoughts are behaviors. You engage in those behaviors. You can observe them as you would any other behavior, but they are not you. They are not the things that control you. I often talk to people when I do this when I work with parents, I work with young adults, adolescents. I said, tell me what you did, not what you thought about what you did. Right. So if you're objectively telling me this is what I did, whether it moved you towards your committed goals or not, right. I exercised, but I didn't do enough. I adjusted my diet, but it wasn't sufficient, right? I did this, but, right? And so we do that. We qualify things a lot in our lives, right? We talk about things when we talk about them not being good enough, or we did them, but, right? When you add that but piece, then that's the subjective aspect of it, that we're still down on ourselves. I increased my steps per day, but I didn't meet my 12,000 steps or 10,000 steps for the day. Okay. So again, thoughts are behavior, and we need to change the function of that behavior. That's what we're looking to work on with our clients. Okay. Being present. Let's talk about what's right now. So, right, I thank you for committing this hour to this. How much of this has been, or how many times, and this is not a question I'm asking, or I'm not judging or anything like that. How many times have your mind gone somewhere else? Right? How many times have you moved off of the idea that I'm talking about this and said, well, what am I doing after this? We got another 20 minutes or so. What am I doing at 10 o'clock? Right? That happens, by the way. That's going to happen. It's not a judgmental thing. Again, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. You must focus on this now. But being present, sometimes we get too caught up in the past or too caught up in the future. There's too much thinking about what's coming next without focusing on what's happening right now. So present moment awareness is what's important. And again, the self as context, right? So I am the context. This is how we observe our own behavior, private and overt events. The I here now piece, right? So this is my experience. Okay. Now, values are the way we want to live our lives. These are not goals, by the way. So sometimes I say goals. Goals are a subset of this, but values are really the way we want to live our lives. Values are never attained. We never get there, but they're how we live our lives. So what is important to you or what is important to your clients at any given point are their values. Okay. So when I've done this with again, individuals who were sort of moving towards their transition ages, and some who have engaged in really significant, difficult behaviors. And we've talked about this in terms of, well, what's important to you? And so it might have been independence or employment or being healthier or having a better relationship with my family. Those are our values. Those aren't necessarily goals. Okay. And we use that as a context. We use that as a framework for looking at our next place, which is committed action. Are we doing things that move us towards those valued outcomes? So how does engaging in, and we weren't judging about the behavior, we call it, interfering behavior. It's just behavior, right? We talk about bad behavior, challenging behavior, difficult behavior. It's behavior, right? Same idea between bad thoughts, right? Negative emotions that we shouldn't be experiencing, and we shouldn't have negative emotions, or we shouldn't have negative thoughts. They're thoughts. It's the function that we have to think about. Okay, and again, so there's a shift as well. There's a lot of stuff out there, right? Release your negative energy, right? Your chi, whatever it may be, right? We're talking about your experiences, not placing that subjective piece to it, being more objective, right? Did it move us towards that or not? If it moved us towards that, let's do more of that if we can. If it didn't move us that way, then what can we do differently? Okay. So the opposite of that would be psychological inflexibility, fusion, experiential avoidance, a conceptualized self. Now, conceptualized self would be that we have an idea of who we are. We know who we are. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is boom. And then when that happens is if we're inflexible about that, then when we're faced with something that contradicts what our conceptualized self is, like a failure, like I'm an expert in the field, I know this stuff without question. And then someone questions you and maybe you don't have a great answer for it. Oh my gosh, that just butted heads now with your conceptualized self. Okay, so actually that's being rigid in our thinking that this is who we are, this is what we do, this is who I am. Okay. Rigid attention to the past and future, right? Perseveration on either, right? I'm perseverating on things that happened in the past, or I'm really concerned about what's going on in the future. having unclear values. What are you sort of living for? What's important to you? How do you live your life? And then inaction, impulsivity, and persistence avoidance. So persistence avoidance is we just don't stick with something for a long period of time. And we see this annually, right? New Year's Day, I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to go on a diet. I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to change something pretty dramatically. And I'm going to go to the gym every day. And then I'll ask the question, well, how often do you go to the gym now? Not in a judgmental, and they say never. And so then the question is, well, okay, how can we move towards our valued outcome, which is, what is it? It's not to go to the gym more. That's a goal. Is it to be healthier? Is it to be able to spend more time with my family? Is it to do more adventurous things that I need to do? I need to lose weight for, to be more active in general. Again, whatever that valued outcome is, that's what we focus on. That's what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so here's a model called the hexaflex. Here's how we think about it. These are all interconnected in terms of psychological flexibility. Sort of our left side is our acceptance and mindfulness piece, and our committed behaviors are on the left. Contact with the present moment, self-context sort of in the middle. They work all the way. So this is just a visual for how you frame the conversation around to the process of psychological flexibility. You have to do these things. And that's hard. It's hard. It's hard to observe something that you feel is negative or objectively. Okay. So what is the function, though? What function does this language serve? Does it serve to pull us away from our valued outcomes or our committed behaviors that move us towards our valued outcomes? And just describe it objectively. Not with a lot of value-laden terms. We have so many terms, again, that we've learned these things. We've learned these relations, right, to what failure is or what anxiety is. And these are things we should avoid anxiety at all costs until the point where you're crossing the street or driving a car, where you actually need to pay attention to, right? You should have a little bit of anxiety. A little bit of anxiety is okay. You should be aware of your environment. If you had no anxiety whatsoever, you'd be walking down the street without paying attention to anything. But we've loaded anxiety with such terms, with such values, with such aversive types of naming, right? It's problematic. So we think about the function, though, not necessarily the term, because again, how one person relates to the term anxiety is going to be different than someone else. We're always focused on the client. Are we moving towards our valued outcomes? Are we engaging in those committed behaviors? We look for a cause. We look for function again. And we're supposed to experience things in therapy. We're supposed to experience those things in therapy as well as outside of therapy. We grow through challenge, and we work on what's here, right? So if you're in a therapy session, we're working on kind of what's going on right now. Okay. That might involve something that happened in the past, but we're not talking about the past here, right? We're working on what's happening now, and then how do we make adjustments going forward? We're not trying to convince the client to change. This is not our job. Our job is to work with them and think about these concepts and make that decision on their own, right? We can talk all day about how people know that they're supposed to do certain things, right? Whether you want to lose weight or exercise more or be healthier or engage more with your family, right? That often will be very easily say, this is what I have to do. I have to do less of this. I have to, be less involved in my preferred activities like that are solitary and do more things with my family. I have to make that shift. Then why doesn't it happen? Okay. That's the part where we're trying to think of what is the function of this? What is it we're telling ourselves, or what are we avoiding? We say, oh, it's too late. I can't make that change. I've already ruined my relationship with person X or person Y. Okay. And then lastly, frequency is not important, not how often, right? There's actually a study a very early study in working with individuals with psychosis. This was not autism, but they were looking at post-treatment ACT versus treatment as usual. And in terms of reporting of hallucinations, And the group that had went through ACT actually reported an increase in hallucinations, but a decrease in believability of those hallucinations. And so we say, well, you have an increase in symptom presentation, but actually improved functioning overall, because we're now aware of the occurrence of these thoughts. They're still occurring. We didn't get rid of them. Okay. Reminds me of Russell Crowe in A Beautiful Mind at the very end there. He's more aware of, I'm not saying he went through ACT or anything, but I'm just, sort of drawing a parallel here where he still experienced these things, these hallucinations, which he knew were not real, but was able to move about and continue and win a Nobel Prize and things. What Russell Crowe did, the person he was playing. All right. So as we have, I just want to kind of go through a couple of things here. Here's just a couple of different models. This is what we call the mindful action plans. This is DJ Moran. He has a website. These resources are available freely on there. This is actually, they use this with staff, but can also use with an individual. And it's just a sort of a worksheet. I am here now, accepting, noticing, doing what I care about. Okay, and it takes those 6 areas of those 6 processes and puts them into a form so that you can talk about it. A couple of exercises that they do, the drop the rope exercise. Again, this is one you can see on YouTube with Dr. Hayes, where he has someone hold the rope, and he says, imagine there's a hole in the middle here, and I'm anxiety. I'm trying to pull you into the rope, pull you into the hole. They pull and they pull and they pull and they pull, and the person on the other end's holding on real tight, trying not to get pulled into the hole. And then he stops and he says, well, what can we do to not fall in the hole? And let go of the rope so you don't get pulled in. Okay. Mindfulness exercises, again, to help with being in the present moment, meditation. Okay. That's a skill. You have to build up a skill in how to be present, how to be mindful in the moment. If you just practice a little bit a day, you're just practicing a few minutes a day. But you want to build up being mindful more often. I do this personally. I do this a lot with driving nowadays. I do mindful driving. And I like to attend to what's happening in the moment. And if someone does something that's sort of, I don't know, road rage worthy, I look and I conceptualize this, and I'm like, I'm experiencing this feeling right now. I've got a place to go. They've probably got a place to go. What's going to keep me going in my direction, right? I have to get to campus to teach a class. Right? If I chase someone or end up engaging in other behaviors, that's going to take me off of my path. So I'll do that. Right? Because we can sort of automatically sort of go through things. And so we end up in our location. How did we get here? Sort of on autopilot. Some diffusion exercises, writing thoughts on pieces of paper, carrying it or crumpling it up. Right? Repeating a phrase over and over again, and we're saying it in a silly voice. Right? These are exercises that we might do. Right? Say, I'm a terrible parent in a baby voice. It changes the function of that a little bit. Right? I write this thought that I have on a piece of paper and I hold it with me. Right? I control it. I have it. I've had with children, I've had them develop a sort of a anxiety critter. I didn't want to call it anxiety monster because of the thing. And I had an individual who was really good at it. And we would talk about the anxiety critter being closer or farther away from them. The critter never really went away, but it was really in terms of what distance they were from the individual. And so some of these metaphors are also related to that. So the leaves on a river metaphor is, observe your thoughts as if they're leaves on a river and watch them pass, right? Watch them go by. Passenger on our bus, you're a bus driver and you want to go in a specific direction, but the passengers are telling you, no, if you go in that direction, we're going to be, angry at you, or we're going to, and they'll get louder and louder as you move towards that direction. Monsters on the Boat is a very similar one, right? If you go to where you want to go, which is the shoreline, right, they're going to say, well, we're going to be very loud with you, and and eventually you sort of move forward. and you get there, and they get there too. But you can also use some of these are exercises. This is not therapy. This is part of the therapy, but it gives some visuals to doing this. So if you're looking for concrete things, the jumping one is, again, this is one that's available on YouTube as well, where he starts with people jumping off a piece of paper, right? That's where you start. That's sort of shaping, right? You start with a very easy task, allegedly, but it could be hard in terms of thinking about addressing functional impairment as related to psychotherapy. And you can also combine that with additional behavior interventions, such as exposure. If you're thinking about anxiety, talking about our spider example before, right? Exposure and shaping still part of that process that you might use in addition to the ACT framework. So there are lots of evidence-based practices as it comes to treatment of anxiety and depression and those types of things. And so use those within an ACT framework. There are some
John,
measures of psychological.
John, I just want to warn you of the time. It's 9:56.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have any questions?
We have just one question right now in the chat.
Okay, great. I'm going to wrap up then. There are some measures here. You can find them all. They're, again, pretty freely available online. If you want copies, I can send you. So in terms of autism, because this is what we're talking about, there is some suggestion that ACT is transdiagnostic. It might be useful for a number of different diagnostic presentations. There are some small sets of data for parent support, believe it or not, work on with parents of autistic individuals than with autistic individuals themselves. But we are starting to see some small N studies for developing, let's say, interview skills. So that's a very specific one. So we're working on the social anxiety around interview skills, but also working on the skills themselves, interviewing, excuse me. And then a review of literature in 2020 indicated a small number of studies, but again, more needs to be done. So we need to do more research. We need to extend this. This is really a lot of that work in general for ACT has been done with adults, some with older adolescents. So we need extensions for children and adolescents. And then this is a process approach. So we have to think about what may work well or need modification. And again, that'll depend on the person you're working with as well. So how you're going to do that. So that's a nutshell. That is it in a nutshell. So, all right. So a list of ACT practitioners. Okay. I can look for those because there are some listed to the Association of Contextual Behavior Science. I don't know if those are free or not. I'm a member, so I can look, so I can find some if there are some in the area. Okay. Those are both questions. So thank you for those. Awesome. Well, I hope this really quick rundown. I have some references here. These are, I believe, will be Eileen. These will be available online.
Yes, I will be posting the slides along with the video next week, most likely.
Great. Great. Okay. Well, now mine here.
A rapid run through, John. This was fantastic. Any last question? Let's wrap it up, John. This was a very nice talk. I thank you very much, and we'll get the slides up there. And we really appreciate you taking your time to do this.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And my email is on there. There are also for the Autism Center emails and YouTube channel. So this will be up and available if you need to slow it down for yourself or anything like that. But
Great. Thank you so much.